Welcome to our first lecture for Sociology 344, Criminal Justice Systems. The title of this audio lecture is Overview of the Criminal Justice System Part I. Now, the first thing I do when I teach this class in the classroom is to ask students what they think the word justice means. And these are some of the typical answers that I get, but really the most common agreement we can come to is that justice has something to do with fairness. So what then is criminal justice? Well, if justice is fairness, then we can think of criminal justice as fairness when it comes to dealing with criminals. Our criminal justice process involves the enforcement of criminal procedures that are defined by law. So we have a set of rules that have to be followed when we deal with criminals. And these criminal procedures and laws themselves exist to protect fairness in interpersonal relationships. So we want to make sure that the end result is a fair decision to make sure that right prevails over wrong. Okay, so that's justice and criminal justice. What's the criminal justice system then? Well, the criminal justice system is the system of people and organizations that maintain or protect criminal justice in our country. So here's a textbook definition: the structure, function, and decision processes of those agencies that deal with the management and control of crime and criminal offenders. Basically, what this means is the police, the court system, and the correctional system. And we'll be talking about all three of these as we move through the course. All right, well, so now we've sort of talked about what justice, criminal justice, and the criminal justice system are. Now, there are two other main points I want to make before we get into sort of the meat of this class. One point that's important to note is that in our country, there are two perspectives on how the criminal justice system operates. And you'll see it says CJS on the top of the slide. Oftentimes that's short for criminal justice system. So when you see that in the future, that's what that means. Okay, so two perspectives on how the criminal justice system operates. The first is called the consensus perspective. And the consensus model assumes that the parts of the criminal justice system, the police, the courts, the prisons, that they all work together with a common goal. And because everybody gets along, cases and people move through the system fairly smoothly. We're assuming that there's lots of cooperation going on, so that's why it's called the system model, and that there are shared goals, as I mentioned. Now, other people feel that this so-called criminal justice system doesn't really work like a system at all, and this is the conflict perspective. According to the conflict perspective, you'll see I called it the non-system model. This model suggests that instead of being a cohesive system, the criminal justice system is more like a big, sprawling bureaucracy with lots of separate agencies that are pretty much independent from each other and all have their own self-serving goals. So each part of the criminal justice system has its own agenda, and they have their own goals, and they really don't care about everybody else. They're all kind of competing to make sure that their goals are fulfilled. Let me give you an example of the conflict perspective in the real world. I've talked to police officers before, and I asked them, so what's your goal as a police department? And they say, well, our goal is to make as many arrests as possible and get as many criminals off the streets as we can. So we want to make sure we make lots of arrests, control crime as much as we can in the communities. Makes sense, right? And so then second thing I ask is, well, aren't you worried about whether or not there's enough beds in the prisons to deal with these people, or enough public defenders in the court system to represent these people when they get to court? And, they typically say, no, we don't really care about that. We're just concerned with our bottom line, which is making arrests and getting criminals off the street. So that would be an example of the conflict perspective, where any particular part of the system is only cares about what helps them. So I always ask students at this point, which do you think is more accurate? And so you can kind of think about that on your own from what you've heard about the criminal justice system, which perspective you would agree with. But again, there are those two perspectives that people have opinions about. Okay, so just like there's two perspectives on how the criminal justice system operates, there's also two perspectives on why we need a criminal justice system. In other words, what should the main goal of the criminal justice system be in our country? The first perspective or opinion about what the goal of the criminal justice system should be is called the individual rights perspective. This is often also called the due process model. According to the individual rights perspective, people who advocate this feel that the criminal justice system exists in order to make sure that people who are accused of a crime are treated fairly. So the concern is with the individual rights of people who've been accused of committing a crime. This makes sense, right? I know if I were accused of committing a crime that I didn't do, I would want to make sure that there are as many protections as possible in the criminal justice system to make sure that I wasn't wrongfully accused or wrongfully charged with a crime, right? So there are some people who feel that this should be the main purpose or goal of the criminal justice system. On the other hand, the second perspective is that the criminal justice system should be more concerned with protecting the public and less concerned with those individual rights of people accused of crimes. So the second perspective argues that we need a criminal justice system to protect society, and that the goal should be to repress crime or control crime rather than focus on those individuals who are accused of crimes. So this perspective is more concerned with maintaining public order and controlling crime. So sometimes it's called the crime control model. Now, if I asked everybody in the class which perspective they thought or which goal they thought was more important, probably you would all not agree. And this is the case in the general public as well. Not everybody agrees on what the criminal justice system should be focusing on. Should we focus on the due process model, or should we focus on the crime control model? The general public typically disagrees, but in the end, what the criminal justice system focuses on depends on what society at any point in time thinks is most important. So we balance these two needs for individual rights or public order. And this balance actually changes over time. So you can probably think of some recent events in our society that would suggest that right now the criminal justice system seems to be concerned with the second goal, that crime control model, right? And less concerned with the individual rights of people accused of crimes. I mean, I think of things that have happened since 9/11, things like increased airport security, the Patriot Act, other crime control agendas that are more concerned with that protecting society issue and less concerned with individual rights. Now, that's the way it is today in society, but 30 years ago, it looked a little bit different. The criminal justice system was more concerned with protecting people's due process when it comes to going through the criminal justice system to make sure that people were treated fairly. So this balance isn't the same at any particular point in our country. And we'll revisit this idea throughout the semester as we look at some recent changes and how the police do their job, and how the courts work, and how we sentence people for crimes. So keep these two perspectives in mind as we go throughout the course. Okay. Next, you should read Chapter 1 in your text and review the entire criminal justice system from start to finish. It does a pretty good job in your text of going through all these steps. I've provided this chart for you because I think it's pretty useful as far as kind of thinking about all the different steps in the criminal justice process. Now, if you click next on Part 2 of this lecture, you'll see that I'm going to explain in more detail several of these steps. But remember, you're also responsible for everything else in the text that I don't go over in lecture. So make sure to review your textbook as well.